So the partners program at Shopify was a way to onboard people who would build shops for other people and grow that side of the ecosystem as well, which was a major, I believe, growth point for Shopify. So as the company scaled that out, it required more resources and better documentation to prevent, the partners team from spending their time answering, as I said, boring questions. So with the actual developer docs in place, the partner docs in place, they were able to grow that system, and then that worked from there.
Welcome to the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast, where Gowri Ramkumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Good day, everyone. Our guest today is Matthew Buttler, Senior Technical Writer at Signiant. Welcome, Matthew, to the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast. How are you doing today?
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm very well, thank you.
Fantastic. So, Matthew, please tell us, how did you initially get into documentation or into the technical writers community? And a little bit more introduction about yourself, please.
Sure. I started off working in support in high tech. As you can imagine, that relies a lot on documentation. And I found that some of our documentation was a little missing and lacking in our knowledge base. So I just started authoring some articles and eventually got picked up as a documentation content specialist for Shopify. I was already working in the support department, but after, working documentation on the sly for a while and supplying my colleagues with additional documentation to help them with stuff like DNS, that kind of thing, they decided to bring me up to be a documentation specialist.
Fantastic. So I'm also aware that you have completed your bachelor's in both education and in English and literature. So how have the skills you gained through your education influenced your technical writing career?
Well, of course, with an English degree, I learned how to write essays really well and how to have good grammar and spelling, which is, of course, key to being a good technical writer. But I find my Bachelor of Education really set up my pedagogical practice for this type of work. I geared my education degree towards more of an older audience for Con Ed and older high school students. And when I got into high tech, I found the same skills I learned there and the same techniques I used to develop lesson plans for that actually wound up being very useful in planning out documentation.
Mm-hmm. Super. So again, just a little bit more about your processes in the current company, Signiant.
Sure.
Yeah. Can you give us some insights on what's your documentation process for the current company and who do you normally involve in such processes?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I normally have a regular sync with our VP of engineering, who gives me sort of a 10,000 feet view of what's going on with the development team. We have a development team of about, I'd estimated it was 75 to 100 developers. So I have an idea of what everyone's working on. We sort of divide between core teams and web teams. The web teams are definitely something I'm more involved with just because they do the user-facing side of our application suites. The core team also does provide us with some utilities, so I do have to do some heavier lifting with that, with the core utilities, like running command line commands and that kind of thing, and really getting into the nitty gritty. Once I have the 10,000 foot view, then I start syncing up with the product managers for each of the related tasks that are going to be completed by development during the next couple sprints. Once I have an idea of what the project's about with product management, I approach the engineers and involve myself heavily with the engineers as soon as I possibly can, just so I can get ahead of their feature coming out, so I can ensure that there are any gotchas or any feature sort of weirdness that may need to be taken care of is at least documented, or if not, sent back to developers for further revision.
That's good. So it looks like a lot of coordination is required at various levels.
Yeah, I find it's very effective, definitely before the pandemic, for me to actually sit and visit with the developers and have a long sort of extended interview with them.
Yeah,
it's a bit more difficult now because of the social distancing and the pandemic happening, where now it's more elongated Slack threads, or if I'm very lucky, a Zoom meeting with them.
Great. So just an extension to that question. So how do you manage your documentation workflow? You did mention that the pandemic has some effect on the overall organizational tasks, but generally, how do you manage your documentation workflow?
Well, there's this sort of jumps into the size of my team. I have another writer with me as well as a developer who's also with us temporarily to help work on our SaaS or our documentation site itself. We use Docs as code. But my other writer and I will sort of divvy up what we work on in terms of product. My other writer's time is also split with marketing because they do have an obligation there as part of their position. But typically we'll divvy it up, determine who wants to take first crack at it. We'll review with each other and sort of go over it with the engineers before we send it to each other for review. Once it's reviewed there for, dotted our I's, crosses our T's, we send it up to the product manager for them to have a final look. And if they like it, then it goes up. If it doesn't, they don't like it, it doesn't go up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, you briefly touched upon how you coordinate with different team members, right? So just on the support that one should get, especially with the writing part, talk me about the symbiotic relationship between documentarians and the support, please.
You did some research. I actually gave a talk on this at Read the Docs in, I believe, 2016. Well, as I mentioned, my growth out of support into documentation seemed like a natural evolution to me, as documentation is relied upon by support as well as authored by documentarians. And so it really helps to have good documentation to prevent boring interactions between customers. This is like an example of the routine question a support agent may get, like how do I click the button on the jobs page, or how do I add a product using the add a product button, like very, very basic stuff that should be documented. This allows the support interaction that's quote boring to then be dealt with very quickly, so that then support agents can actually spend time working on interesting problems or actual troubleshooting problems that require support intervention or engineer help, as may be the case.
Right. Very interesting, Matthew. And again, thank you for that community contribution. So let's go back a little bit to your experience with Shopify. Through your LinkedIn, we came to know that you previously developed software documentation for Shopify. Mm-hmm. So what was it like developing technical content and documentation for a leading e-commerce software provider like Shopify?
Honestly, it was a lot of fun. Specifically the part that I worked the most on was our partner development docs. So the partners program at Shopify was a way to onboard people who would build shops for other people and grow that side of the ecosystem as well, which was a major, I believe, growth point for Shopify. So as the company scaled that out, it required more resources and better documentation to prevent, the partners team from spending their time answering, as I said, boring questions. So with the actual developer docs in place, or the partner docs in place, they were able to grow that system, and then that worked from there. Really, my experience at Shopify was fairly limited, though. I was there in very early days. I believe the docs team was 3 people, including myself at the time. So it's grown significantly since then. I've been in contact with my colleague Jason Christie there, and he definitely espouses that there's much more than 3 people now, which is great.
Yeah. Jason has been our guest as well. Very, very nice talk we had as part of the podcast episode. Super. And again, throughout your social media, you state that you're seeking skill advancement and thrill enhancement. So what's that? It's rhyming. So what is that?
I think it says what it says on the tin, Gowri. I mean, I'm seeking skill advancement. I like to learn more things. I like to learn more complex things that allow me to be a better documentation writer, where I can get really in the nitty gritty of the code, like getting down to the C++ code base and really having a good look. The thrill enhancement, man, I'm looking here for a good time. That's what I'm looking for.
Nice. You didn't mention about the team size in Shopify when you were there, but what's your team size in Signiant at the moment?
Would you believe it or not? It's 3. Seems to be the magic number I have. It started off actually, when I started off at Signiant, I was replacing a technical writer who was on contract for 3 days a week. Having a look around and seeing what I saw in the Signiant knowledge base, I quickly realized there was 5 days a week worth of work. So I managed to increase my contract and get hired on full time after a brief contract in 2017, I want to say. Mm-hmm. That sounds about right. So 2018, I started full time as their first ever full time documentation writer. As part of that, I saw quickly that there was 8 days of work a week. 8 days of work a week. So I started sort of lobbying for a co-op student, at the very least, to help me out with the workload. At the time, we were also converting from an old CMS knowledge base on Salesforce Desk over to is actually Salesforce Desk was approaching end of life, so we needed a solution. And I, being familiar with Dox's code and already using sort of a very loose Dox's code system prior to that, I decided to go ahead and install a Dox's code sort of set up there and maintain that ecosystem. We already did have one site that was already Dox's code running on Middleman, which is a Ruby framework for static site generators, running our API docs. And I replaced the CMS with Gatsby, which is a JavaScript framework, which was fairly new at the time. Mm-hmm. And I'm fairly happy with it, actually. It allows for pretty good performance. It's not too hard to maintain. But my other technical writer and I work on both those sites. And as I mentioned, I have a temporary developer who's a co-op student now as well, who is helping us out with just sort of some gardening around our static site generator, making sure they're up to date in terms of dependencies and also adding some new features to our documentation.
All right. So that sounds really interesting, Matthew. So much to share, right? So just on your reporting, you did mention there are 3 people in the team, but how does the reporting works in your case? And what kind of reports do you share?
Sure. With that, really, Christine, my colleague, and I work really closely together. Because I do have a bit more experience in technical writing than her, she does seek my advice from time to time, but really she and I work very, very commonly together. I would say we're peers more than she reports to me than anything. We both report to the VP of engineering directly, which is very helpful. As I mentioned, he gives us a 10,000 foot view of what's going on. And we also when pandemic is not on, we're co-located with product managers, which also gives us sort of a informal channel to back channel in to see what's really going on. And that kind of thing. Informal interactions I find are very useful. These little micro interactions we would get even just over chat on Slack or in a Zoom meeting or whatever. It really is not necessarily the content of the meeting that's important. It's what's said outside of the normal content of the meeting that may be more crucial to documentation.
Yeah, very, very true, Matthew. Very well said as well. Now, in your opinion, what has been the most important innovation when it comes to document tracking during your career?
Innovation in terms of document tracking?
Yep.
Honestly, I would say the adoption of Dox's code has been probably the greatest thing that I've seen. I worked in shops that use PDFs, so they use CMSs and stuff. And honestly, that falls out of date quick, and it can be very difficult to review, especially if you're just doing raw authoring over on a WordPress site, which I've done. That's difficult because you have to sort of save it as draft and have the person go into the edit view to review it. Whereas with Dox's code, you can stage it up on a staging site, show someone how it's actually going to look in production and get approval on that rather than just sort of a mimicked model of that. I would say that's a huge advantage that we now have. Unfortunately, it does create a barrier to entry in terms of documentation where you should know a little bit of code, at least your way around HTML, unfortunately, which is, again, can be difficult for some. I appreciate that. But honestly, being able to get a view of what my documentation is going to look like in production and get that reviewed by people is crucial.
Nice. One thing I forgot to ask you is your documentation with Signiant publicly available, or is it something behind like a privately owned documentation?
It is fully publicly available. In fact, I actually see documentation not just as a support tool. I also see it as a form of sales enablement. So what I mean by that is that our sales engineers who may do more technical work with our customers as they're getting stood up. We do work with a lot of enterprise customers, like very large media entertainment entities. And they often have a team that wants to work with our sales engineers to get stood up. So our sales engineers and our support team who are help onboarding customers also provide the help documentation to give them a sense of what they're going to be doing. Like our system requirements are always up to date. In fact, those are probably some of the heavily reviewed docs that we have, just to ensure that our customers are providing adequate resources to run our software.
Yep. So do you know if your marketing team is generating any organic search traffic from your knowledge base?
Yeah, we do get some from our marketing team, but really a lot of it is like hand-holding from our support and sales team to sort of point our customers to our documentation, even before they're even in the sales funnel, like they may be a prospect or something, but they'll typically have a look at documentation before they even begin, which is quite flattering, to be honest.
Yep, very true. So I think with that, we are done with all the general questions. Matthew, anything that you would like to share before we go to the rapid fire round?
Actually, I've been looking forward to the rapid fire round, so let's go ahead.
Fantastic. So just taking back to your initial days or flashback, who have you learned the most about documentation from in your career?
I really have to give it to my mentor, Tina Klein Walsh, who is a technical writer for, actually she's a technical writing manager of some kind. I'm not sure what her job title is, but she works for a large enterprise company, BlackBerry QNX. And she, honestly, we met back in 2015, just as I was finishing up at Shopify. And we actually met on a plane and flying to a documentation conference, and we sort of hit it off there. And she's sort of really helped guide me towards this point in my career. She's really given me a good sense of what's out there, because she's been in technical writing for a while, and she has been a really good guidance on helping me advance my career.
Thank you. Can you share a documentation related resource you have consumed recently?
Yeah, this came to me informally, actually, from someone who's not at all in documentation at all, but he saw this. It was a conference talk by Kathy Sierra, who is a game developer. I think her company name is Serious Pony, but it was actually XOXO Fest back in 2015, which is oddly enough when I met Tina, when I first started going to the Write the Docs conferences in Portland. She spoke about having real empathy for users and really putting yourself in sort of the beginner's mindset and really approaching documentation like a human would, rather than really not in terms of this is the official way of doing something. Rather, this is how you empower yourself to be able to do the thing. You, and her sort of phrase is, you are a badass. That's the thing. They really want to make the user feel empowered. And I really took a lot from that. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to empower my users. I don't want them to feel like I'm telling them what to do. I want them to feel like they know what they're doing.
Would you be okay to repeat that resource one more time, Matthew, please?
Sure. That was, I believe, Kathy Sierra. Let me do a quick search here. Yeah, Kathy Sierra from Serious Pony. It's her XOXO speech from 2015.
Thank you. That's great. Super. So my very last question to you is, what is the one piece of documentation related advice you would give to your 20-year-old self? Oddly
enough, when I was 20 years old, I had no idea what a technical writer was. I thought a technical writer was someone who wrote airplane manuals. Mm-hmm. I would go back to my 20-year-old self and I'd say, dude, look at yourself. You're 20 years old. You're in university. Gear your career towards technical writing. It's really going to do wonders for you. Super. So what you're saying is just try new things and explore. Yeah, be open to new experiences and don't approach things without a cognitive bias where you look at things and you sort of see things as, oh, this is just that thing that's very silly and frivolous. I don't want to do that. It's a worthwhile career, and I would tell them that, be open to new experiences and new things. Absolutely. They are just very new and young and
fresh, right?
Yeah.
Super. So Matthew, I know it's just been just over 20 minutes, but the amount of experience you have shared with us is absolutely wonderful. And the lot of key points that we can take from this episode. Now, before we say bye to our audience, any last minute tips or tricks or anything that you would like to add to this episode?
Yeah, I would say something technical writers can always do is get involved with the engineers as close as you can and start getting involved with their process as soon as possible, and try to be as forgiving of them, because honestly, engineers are not the greatest communicators from time to time, but honestly, they're trying their best to communicate with technical writers, and sometimes they don't even really know what you need to know. So make sure that you ask a lot of questions when you need to get something done,
True, very true. So that you're clear on what you're doing, and it also helps to bring the best within the documentation.
Yeah, stay curious. Never stop asking questions. You never know.
That's true. So Matthew, thank you once again for your time, and whatever you're doing, good luck with it and with all your new project initiatives, and stay safe and take care.
Yeah, you as well, Gowri. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.